Another statement that we noted was that America doesn't want a Cold War.
We don't get a choice. This is high school 101. I'm the pimply-faced skinny kid, right? But I'm just enamored with the cheerleader. And I really want her to, appreciate me the way I appreciate her. Who defines that relationship? I would like to see the relationship here. But the person who defines the relationship is the one who values it least. And if this person's not going to have anything to do with me, then the relationship is down here. It's not up here. It's the same in international relations. We want this to be a cooperative relationship like we have with other countries. We've tried for 40 years to get it to that point. It's a very biblical number, but after 40 years, you have to assume that this plan isn't working and we're going to have to change direction. And so the relationship is defined by the lowest common denominator, and that's the PRC approach, which, guess what, is a Cold War. It's not a shooting war, right? They aren't sortying their ships to go sink our ships yet. It's not a hot war, it's a Cold War. It's ideological and, in fact, is existential. One of the two coming out of this is going to lose, like the Soviets did at the end of the first Cold War. So my point is that it is a Cold War, and it's being defined by Chinese actions, not ours. So to deny that we want a Cold War doesn't matter. They do. They're executing a Cold War. We should acknowledge that.
Fascinating.
I could be wrong.
No, it seems pretty obvious to me. Given this reality, how can we even be talking about cooperating with the Chinese regime on climate, for example? Right?
The military, and I think the rest of the U.S. government now uses this construct of the instruments of national power, and they call it the DIME: diplomacy, information, military, economic. They've added a few more: finance, intelligence, law, and tech. But if you think of this in terms of the DIME, it's a little easier to understand. When we say war, the first thing Dave Stillwell thinks of is my F-16 with bombs, kinetics, killing people and breaking their things, right? That's not how the PRC thinks of war. They think of trade war, they think of information warfare, right? Political warfare and all these things. This is an area where we need to actually rise to their level, because to date, we still think of the relationship as a peaceful one. Well, if your enemy's fighting you, if the other side is fighting you, and they call us the enemy, by the way. Since 1950, the Korean War, internal PRC government talks about the U.S. as the enemy. It was a big step when the Trump administration named China a strategic competitor. People lost their minds over that. Competitor is a soft word compared to what's going on here. But when we say war, we need to get out of this mindset of people wearing uniforms and killing other people and blood being shed, and think more in terms of, biological warfare with COVID, economic warfare with COVID, information warfare with what's going on inside our own media, the fact that the PRC can influence what American readers are seeing, and we have no ability to do that. And so in those terms, they are competing across the board. Your question is, can we cooperate in any of those? We can, but as Secretary Pompeo said at a speech at the Nixon Library, distrust and verify. We signed this agreement. You need to keep coming back to that agreement and saying, are they upholding their side of that agreement? And if they're not, then we don't have an agreement. So how about climate cooperation? How did that work out the first time for the Paris Agreement? I asked people, what did China actually sign up for in Paris? Because they hit us on the head for leaving. Well, the PRC signed up for continuing to not just pollute at this level. They agreed to continue to increase polluting as their economy grows. The amount of carbon output is going to increase until 2030, they say, at which point it will begin to taper and then achieve carbon neutrality in 2060. How many people know that? We assume that they shut down all their coal plants and that they're all gone solar and all that stuff, and nothing. That is not true. This is an information warfare tactic where now you go to the US, and even our allies and friends are pointing to us going, you guys backed out of Paris. You're not serious about climate. Well, of course we are. But the restrictions that we signed up for in the Paris Accord were far more economically damaging than anybody else. And economy is extremely important, as we see now with inflation and all that stress that's going on. So you can conduct Cold War and still cooperate, but you have to make sure the other side is actually doing what they said they would in terms of cooperation. And from what I've seen, there are very few examples of that.
We live in an era of censorship and disinformation, and it can be really hard to know what's true and what's false in this information climate. To get honest information and insights you can trust, Join us on Epoch TV. You can sign up for your 14-day free trial at ept.ms/free trial Jan. That's ept.ms/free trial JAN. I can't help but be reminded of the name Stealth War, I guess coined by your protege, Robert Spalding, who's been on the show many times since. But it's a completely different approach to warfare that the CCP is using. And so, you might ask yourself right now, the US is kind of almost in every area is experiencing, a really difficult time. And people will say, well, it's because of our own policy during COVID, but where did that come from, right?
Where did the election problems come from? It came from big changes made in the summer of 2020, going into elections when we could no longer vote in person because of COVID. Let's always point back to the reason for these things happening. And I think it'll make the divisions in our country far less visible or important.
Why don't you tell me what you think about how does COVID fit into this whole picture? And you also, actually, I should ask you this because you mentioned casually COVID and biological warfare in the same sentence, and some people might want to know, what do you mean by that, Dave?
So obviously, this is probably the thing that defined my time at State Department was COVID, right? In December of 2019, the U.S. consulate in Wuhan that we supervised began noticing there was something that looked like SARS was going on, but the PRC kept reassuring us, this is okay, we learned from SARS, we got this. And then in early January, we realized they didn't have it, and off we go. I don't have any evidence to this. No, I do. We have evidence. Let's look at this. My guess is that when the PRC saw what was going to happen, what COVID was going to do to the PRC, Xi Jinping has not left China since COVID. Have you seen that? He has yet to leave the Zhongnanhai compound. He's heading to Hong Kong here soon. It'll be interesting to see if he actually shows up or not. The people who are going to see him in Hong Kong have to go through, it was a week of isolation before they could actually see the boss. He seems very much a germaphobe, and he does not want to die of this thing. He seems very concerned about COVID. Clearly, they weren't that concerned in January of 2020 when Wuhan had this annual spring festival event where 40,000 people participated in a potluck in a city that was burning up with COVID at the time, because we think it escaped sometime in late November. And by that time, a lot of people had it. Those people were allowed to continue to leave Wuhan for international travel, yet they bottled up Wuhan on the 23rd of January. So you couldn't leave Wuhan to go anywhere else in PRC, but you could go international. That needs to be looked at. And then somewhere around the 20th of January, the People's Daily and others very proudly proclaimed that Major General Chun Wei, the head of the PRC biowarfare section in the People's Liberation Army, was being deployed to Wuhan to get control of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and to get things under control. Most people read that and said, oh good, they're doing it. I read that and went, you're sending a PLA general to what we thought is the civilian Wuhan Institute of Virology to get under control? There's a connection I don't think they wanted to make. And I think that's true because those announcements have been pulled down off of, you can't find those anymore. Type in Chun Wei Wuhan January 2020 and you'll find nothing. So at the time, I don't think they made the connection that there was a biowarfare aspect to this. I am not saying this is a genetically engineered, I'm not saying any of that. But do you think the PLA had interest in taking advantage of what was going on there in terms of engineering bugs? I think they did.